How's the sound? Thank you. Well, the study guide has been posted, as you know, on the Canvas module page. It is cleverly hidden in a module entitled Study Guides, Reading Guides. That's where it is, and it's like the third from the top or something like that. If you've looked at it, do you have any questions? Okay, as I speak, your wonderful teaching assistants are handing out 4x6 index cards. You may put notes on both sides of these index cards, and you may bring those notes with you on Friday when you come to the test, and you may look at that card. If there are certain names or dates or events or whatever that you think you might need to know, I mean, you don't know yet what you need to know because you don't know the exact question, but things that you know are important and you just can't seem to remember, because this is not a class where I want you to focus on memorization. Remember the three questions. There's what happened. There's why or how did this happen? Why did this happen? Why did the colonists resist the British reforms? And then, what are the consequences? And I'll ask you a question that asks you to explain something that happened. And anybody making a good explanation is going to provide an example or two or three or a specific, you know what I'm saying? To sort of fortify your answer. Okay, now do you have any questions? Let me remind you that the teaching assistants have office hours this week. I have office hours on Wednesday. Ian Green has office hours, and I think he's with us today. Yeah, there's Ian Green. He is holding a test prep Tuesday night at 5:30 in Gehring Hall 105. Gehring is just right over yonder. You can look it up on the UT map if you're not familiar with it. Now, do you have any questions? Okay. Last Friday, if I recall correctly, the last thing I was talking to you about was Pontiac's rebellion. Is that what you remember as well? Thank you. Yes, Pontiac's rebellion. Chief Pontiac led a rebellion, and it went on for about a year and a half. It began in May of 1963 and went on through 1963 and into 1964 before a truce was signed. Now, in the textbook, if you have the 5th brief edition, I don't know if it's in the Seagull book or not, but there is an excerpt from one of Pontiac's speeches. The excerpt that I have doesn't say when or exactly to whom he made this speech. He clearly made it to an English audience. I don't know if it was English from England, like English soldiers and officials, or English-speaking colonists, but hopefully you've read it. It's assigned reading. I'm just going to read the first few lines. It'll break your heart, I think. Englishmen, although you have conquered the French, you have not yet conquered us. We are not your slaves. These lakes, these woods and mountains were left to us by our ancestors. They are our inheritance, and we will part with them to none. Your nation supposes that we, like the white people, cannot live without bread or pork and beef. But you ought to know that He, the Great Spirit, the great Master of life, has provided food for us in these spacious lakes and on these woody mountains. You know, Pontiac, no one from any of the Indian nations was asked to be a part of the Treaty of Paris. I mean, it's like, what? It was actually no recognition. To not recognize any entitlement to the land is not to recognize these people. What an insult. So, they rebelled. They did not win. But then neither did the French. So, the British and the English-speaking colonists, they move on. Now, at the end of the war, the British were aware of some problems. There had been more British soldiers and officials and so on in the mainland colonies than at any other time in the history of the mainland colonies. And these English soldiers and officials and the English-speaking colonists, they'd seen each other up close. And they often didn't like what they saw. To the English-speaking soldiers and officials, the colonists seemed crude and unrefined and so on. But worse than that, it became very apparent to the English in the colonies during the war. It became very apparent how much evasion of the Navigation Acts was going on. That's otherwise known as smuggling, especially in trade with the West Indies. That was disturbing. That was disturbing. It was like, wait a minute, don't they know they're British colonies? Don't they know we're the mother country? So, in the middle of Pontiac's rebellion, there was a British proclamation that created the proclamation line of 1763. Now, on the right, you see in broad terms, in terms of national claims of everybody except peoples of the First Nations, that's what you see in the map on the right. And in the map on the left, more things are identified, and that orange line is the proclamation line of 1763. And the English, in 1763, they built a few forts along that line. And the proclamation to the colonists was, you may not venture beyond this line. You may not settle west of this line because we cannot afford to fight another war on your behalf. So, they were in the middle of fighting, this confederation of Native Americans led by Chief Pontiac. And so, hoping to not do this again and again and again, they said, okay, that's it. And it's not as if that area was densely settled, but much of that area, the area from the proclamation line to the East Coast, much of that area is used for farming or for raising cattle or dairy cows, and especially commercial farming. And those things take a lot of land. Yes, more people could live there, but then the tobacco, the rice, the indigo couldn't grow there. Whatever. The British were hurting. They had accumulated a massive war debt during this 7 years war. And not only did they want the war to be over, they did not want to continue to fight in North America. They had defeated their worst rivals, the French. They didn't want to have to continue to fight the Native Americans. And if the Anglo-English-speaking settlers would just leave the Native Americans alone, it would be okay. So the British thought. Hence the proclamation line. And the awareness of smuggling. And they have this war debt. Well, just as the British found the colonists crude and somewhat vulgar, common, the colonists found the British overbearing and pretentious. The British had become aware of this smuggling, which, especially during a war, is a quasi-treasonous activity. And that sort of encouraged an outrage at what the British in Britain perceived to be how little the colonies were doing to support the mother country. Now, I've told you before, there was enough voluntary compliance with the Navigation Acts, you know, that Britain was profiting off the colonies and the colonists were profiting, but, you know, it could have been more. And now they have a war debt. So they wanted to be more to pay this war debt. And then there's the continuing cost of defense, because they built these forts along the Proclamation line. And they've got to station redcoats, English soldiers, at all these forts. And so they're continuing to protect the colonists, although from the colonists' perspective, it was like, well, are those soldiers there to protect us from the Native Americans, or are they there to protect the Native Americans from us? And getting the land which we know belongs to England, but which England won't let us English colonists claim. You see the two sides there. So, but the colonists had grievances as well. They had not been, you know, I told you, they had always looked up to the English and praised, you know, English literature. I mean, that was, you know, going to England on a trip, that was like going to Mecca. And most of the laws and major institutions in the colonies were based on English laws and institutions. But not being able to get more land, and they didn't like the attitude of the English towards them during the war. And then the English began to impose some reforms on the mainland colonies. I hate it when this happens. Come on. I wasn't ready for you, but okay. And the reforms are, on the one hand, taxes, because, you know, they have this war debt to pay. And they figure, you know, yes, we defeated our enemy in Europe and in North America, the French, but that was for the benefit of the North American colonists as much as it was for us. Surely they can help us pay the war debt. But as I said, the colonists had their own complaints. And some of them had to do with the British, and some of them just had to do with some rough times. And the biggest of the rough times was when the war was over, although there was still a garrison of soldiers along the Proclamation line, at the forts on the Proclamation line of 1763. Most of them and the English officials had gone home. There is a rather immediate post-war recession in the colonies, because while all the soldiers were there, the British were providing subsidies to the colonies to help support and house and feed the soldiers. And then the soldiers, they were living there. They would go to the taverns. They would spend money. So there had been a wartime boom. And now they were gone. And there was a wartime bust. Serious economic recession. Add to that all the personal indebtedness. You read in Foner about increased consumer spending in the 18th century, 1700s, and increased individual debt. Okay. Now it's increased debt and the economy is in a recession. This is troubling to the economists. Of course it would be. And during the 18th century, there had been tremendous population growth in the colonies due to natural increase and due to immigration. But there had not been a tremendous increase in the amount of land that was available to the mainland colonists. This was creating a fierce land hunger. In 1675, there had been something of a civil war in Virginia because of the unavailability of enough land for the landless, newly freed, indentured servants. And over the course of the 18th century, we know that as the era of salutary neglect, and it was, which is why nobody noticed that the colonists were trading so freely with the French or the French colonies in the West Indies or whatever. But it was also a time when, in most of the colonies experienced, from time to time, conflicts between the colonial assemblies and what they had voted for and the colonial governors. Now, more often than not, the colonial assemblies got their way because, after all, the governor is living in that colony. The governor has his advisory council, and they're appointed by the king. But other than that, the governor's pretty isolated. But still, the governor has the imprimatur of the king. So, there are these conflicts, and regardless of who won, these conflicts were difficult. So, the British are interested in imposing certain reforms to reduce the smuggling and to increase the money that the colonies contribute to England. So they begin with the Sugar Act. Now, the Sugar Act was not a tax. The Sugar Act was essentially enforcement for the Navigation Acts. It was the means for a much more intense and complete enforcement of the Navigation Acts. And it specified that English officials could board any colonial ship and search it and see whose goods they were taking back home, who they were trading with unofficially. And if that person, the captain of that ship, was in fact smuggling or evading one of the Navigation Acts or the Sugar Act, that person would be tried in a vice admiralty court. Now, what that means for our purposes, tried in a military court as opposed to a civil court where the jury would be other colonists. This is a military court tried by Englishmen from the English Navy or English officialdom. Not much chance of getting off. So the colonists, they didn't like this at all. They had depended upon getting sugar from the West Indies for decades. So they were angry about the Sugar Act, but they hoped they could find a way about it. And then there was the Stamp Act. And I'm not going to belabor these tax acts because you'll read about them in Foner, but I'll just remind you that the Stamp Act, most official papers, in order to be official papers, one had to buy a stamp to put on it to make it official. Okay. Well, The colonists didn't like that at all. And there were two reasons they didn't like it. They didn't like it because it was a tax. And they had never, ever, ever before they were used to commercial trade. That was the Navigation Acts, okay? But never before had Parliament passed legislation that put a tax on the English colonists. That, for them, is what they called an external tax. It's coming from outside our colonial assemblies. They levy taxes for the colonists. Parliament? What's Parliament? We don't have anything to do with Parliament. But we vote for our colonial assemblies. So they didn't like that. And of course the British response was, look, come on guys. Parliament represents all the people in the British Empire, whether they live in England and vote for Parliament or not. They virtually represent all the colonists. And the colonists met in New York at the Stamp Act Congress, and Virginia had its own Stamp Act Congress. And they wrote a Stamp Act resolution that they sent to Parliament. And this is where you get the words, no taxation without representation. The colonial assemblies could pass laws that imposed taxes on the people in that colony. And the colonists may or may not like that. But it was legitimate because the colonial assembly represented all the colonists. But they had no say in Parliament. Now, two things here. On the whole subject of taxes that the British leveled, it seemed very, very odd to the British that the colonists were opposing this, because the British mainland colonists were the least taxed people in all the world, except perhaps for the Polish. They paid fewer taxes than anybody, except perhaps for the Polish. And they were like, come on, we're just asking you to help out here. And then the British also didn't understand the colonial reaction, because everybody in England paid stamp tax, bought stamps and paid a tax to put the stamps on official documents. Oh. This is a picture, a drawing of the Stamp Act Congress meeting in Virginia. There were demonstrations all up and down the coast protesting the Stamp Act. So, no taxation without representation. And the British say, but Parliament virtually represents everybody in the British Empire. Okay, not so for the colonists, because they made a distinction between, the British said, Parliament virtually represents everybody. No virtual about it. Our colonial assemblies provide actual representation for the people that live in that colony, because we vote for them. None of us, not a single one of us has ever cast a vote for anybody in Parliament. Well, that was true. So, that representation argument, that they got him, right? Yeah, except not every adult, not even every male adult in England voted for the member of Parliament that would represent his district in the House of Commons. No, there was no universal adult male suffrage in England. You had to be a property owner and some other things. And there was no universal adult male suffrage in the colonies. There were gobs of people in the colonies that did not vote for the assemblymen that would represent them in the colonial assemblies. Of course, women didn't vote. Of course, slaves didn't vote, but there were a lot of adult white men that didn't vote. If you did not own a certain amount of land, and if you were not in the South a member of the Church of England, and if you were not in the North a member of the Congregational Church, you did not vote. So what's this no taxation without representation? I mean, some of those disenfranchised people could have made an issue of that, but they didn't. Which, I don't know, maybe that means they thought it was fair. I mean, the reason people without land didn't vote, the thinking was that in order to have a real vested interest in one's community, you had to be a landowner because that signified something of a permanent tie to that community. And you would take your vote more seriously. Okay, I see that, but still. Well, no taxation without representation. And all of these protests. And some of these protests were crowd actions. And the crowd was almost an institution in 18th century America. Crowds had functions. It was crowds that served as voluntary fire departments. It was crowds that rushed to help put out a fire. It was crowds that gathered to call attention to this or that or whatever. And it was crowds, sometimes led by the newly formed Sons of Liberty, which was kind of a secret organization in some places, not in some other places. And the crowds, they tar and feathered British customs officials or other British officials that they didn't like, strung them up on maypoles, harassed them in all sorts of ways. Crowd action was a significant part of the protest. So, okay, Parliament is well aware of this. And they're like, okay. And I don't know, I haven't read documents of the speeches that were made in Parliament as they took note of the Stamp Act resolution and of all the demonstration. And of course, and I have not read correspondence between different people in Parliament, their opinion about this, that, or the other. So I cannot, with any historical certainty, tell you why Parliament decided to repeal the Stamp Act, but they did. I think it's possible they thought, okay, this was too much too soon. These people are angry, they're upset, and they have forgotten that they are colonies. And colonies are created to serve the mother country. So we need to remind them of that first, and then we'll levy the taxes. So they repealed the Stamp Act, and then Parliament passed something called the Declaratory Act. And the Declaratory Act declared that Parliament has full authority to make laws binding the colonies. In other words, Parliament has supremacy over the colonial assemblies. This was basic. This was a basic principle for the British Empire. Well, the colonists weren't happy with this, not at all. And Parliament didn't stop there, as you know from Foner. Declaratory Act was 1766. And then the Townshend Acts. And I have to go back to get that. I don't know how it got out of place, but it did. The Townshend Acts of 1767. Now, they thought, okay, if we pass one tax act, but it imposes taxes on a lot of things, we will be able to raise revenue without protests of 5 different pieces of legislation. And a lot of the things they put taxes on were very common household goods that everybody would be buying. And Parliament also thought, you know, the things that the Townshend Act covered, put taxes on, were things that were mostly imported from England. You know, like cups and saucers, like silver vases. They didn't make those things for the most part in the colonies. They imported them from England. So Parliament said, you know, this is a lot like the Navigation Acts. We're putting like a tariff on certain imports. So the colonists are more likely to accept this. Even Ben Franklin thought that the colonists might see the Townshend Acts, because of the kinds of things that were identified to be taxed, as really quite similar to the Navigation Act tariffs on imported goods. They did not see it that way. They did not see it that way at all. And so the Townshend Acts were protested. John Dickinson's letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania. Well, John Dickinson wasn't a farmer, but he was a wealthy Philadelphia lawyer. But anyway, he argued that Parliament had no right to regulate trade through duties on foreign imports, had no constitutional authority to tax goods in order to raise money. Parliament said, they're not getting the point that the colonies and the mother country have a mercantile relationship. The colonies exist to benefit the mother country. So, the Massachusetts Circular Letter began to be circulated in 1768. And Boston was the center of protest over the Townshend Acts. In February of 1768, the Massachusetts House of Representatives approved a letter written by Samuel Adams, no less. You've heard of him. He makes beer. No, he didn't then. Written by Samuel Adams. It was an address to other colonial assemblies. And the letter denounced the Townshend Acts. It urged colonies to cooperate with each other in their protest. Well, the Secretary of State in England heard about this and said, okay, we can't have this. And so he orders the royal governors in all the colonies to dissolve the assemblies of the colonies. Does that sound a little bit like what James II did? Well, the British didn't see it that way. They just felt like, okay, we've got to remind the colonists about our relationship. But the colonists are like, dissolving our colonial government? What happened to our rights as Englishmen? Well, this was actually a threat. It was going to dissolve the government of any colony that signed or endorsed that letter. Okay, Now, let's stop for a minute and ask, why were the colonists so very, very, very upset by all of this? Their taxes were low. They were the lowest taxed people in all the world. They knew they were colonies. They knew Britain had a war debt. They knew Britain had to raise money. Why wouldn't Britain ask the colonists to help them pay the war debt? Now, from the British perspective, that is absolutely reasonable. And from the colonist perspective, they are being abused. Their rights as Englishmen are being trampled on, and they have valued those rights. As recently as 1763, they had championed being a part of the British Empire. So, how is it that the colonists and the British have such different interpretations about the British attempt to raise money to help pay the war debt and the British attempt to impose the Navigation Acts? Why do they see this so differently? Well, that's what I'm going to talk about now. Most of the ideas and beliefs that shaped the American Revolution, that shaped this resistance and then fueled the revolution, are found in the literature of the Glorious Revolution. You remember the Whigs in Parliament. They were the ones, many of them knew John Locke. They'd been talking with John Locke. John Locke, during and after the Glorious Revolution, was writing 2 treatises on civil government where he talks about consent of the governed. And it's the Whigs that say, all right, we cannot have this king because he has a Catholic son. And it's possible that when that son grows up, he will re-Catholicize, and he doesn't pay Parliament any attention. This cannot stand. So, you know what happened. All right. William and Mary come to the throne. They agree to the Bill of Rights. They agree to the Constitution. And they agree that this will be a constitutional monarchy, which is to say, Parliament has power. This pretty much defines what scholars have hence called the Whig theory of politics. And the Whig theory of politics is this: government has to be balanced. All the interests of the people that live in a country, their interests have to be represented in government in a balanced way. Why? Because all people lust for power. Power corrupts. And absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so, if any one branch of government has too much power, it will use that power to put down one of the other parts of government. Because that's what power does. It lusts for more power. It's in human nature to seek power and to oppress those that have power. So, the Whig theory of politics was, we got to have balanced government. Traces of this go all the way back to Aristotle. We have to have balanced government. There can be a monarch, an aristocracy, and the people. House of Lords, House of Commons, monarch. Now, if the monarch has too much power, then this is what we call tyranny. If the House of Lords, these are the people with money, if they have a preponderance of power. This is what we call oligarchy, rule by the rich. You've heard of that. If the people have too much power, this is anarchy. Rule by the people is anarchy. And tyranny, oligarchy, anarchy, they are all equally despicable and equally dysfunctional. They're not good, so we have to have balanced government. And an Englishman has to be ever vigilant, lest one of these aspects of government tries to assert power over the other. Because they may try to do that. We lust for power. So, the colonists had been persuaded by this argument since 1688. And in the late 1600s and in the early 1700s, they read Locke and they read commentaries on Locke and they read commentaries on the Whig theory of politics. And then, in the 1720s, a political party emerges in England, and they call themselves the Country Party. And to tell you the truth, they didn't have much influence in England at all. In England, nobody paid them much attention, but you know, their literature, their pieces in the newspaper, so on and so forth, made it to the colonies, and it really caught the colonists' attention. Why? What did they write about? They were rather a motley group of dissenters. Well, they elaborated on the Whig theory of politics. They wrote to expose what they thought was corruption already in this ideal British government. And the substance of their view, what they emphasized from the Whig theory of politics, is that in the political world, everything is a constant struggle between power and liberty. And the countrymen believed that, or the Country Party, believed that man's deepest nature was selfish and ruled by passion for domination. That's just what it was. Rather Hobbesian view of human nature. Thus, they believed that liberty was always under siege and that constant vigilance was required to keep power from becoming oppression and to keep rulers from changing into plunderers and murderers. I mean, pretty dramatic rhetoric. But as I say, they were widely read in the colonies. Now, and why do you think that the colonists took this message so to heart? I mean, it's not as if there was a coup going on in England at the time. Things were calmer in England. Well, they were in the throes of the Industrial Revolution, and there were a lot of those problems. But in terms of the Parliament and the King getting along and all of that, I mean, that was going better than it had been in a century. So why do these words so attract the attention of the colonists? Well, the colonists remember their Protestant heritage, and for most of them it's a Calvinist heritage. They already absolutely believed in the complete depravity of humankind. They absolutely believed that men were inherently selfish. So, that was easy. And this sort of lust for power, and one group trying to get dominance over another group, like in Bacon's Rebellion, or in other intra-colony disputes. Now, their interpretation and applying that to the intra-colony disputes is, I'll grant you, a little overblown. But these people took themselves very seriously. So, having grown up with stories about the Glorious Revolution, having grown up reading John Locke, reading about human nature, reading about the necessity of consent for the governed, and without that consent, one has the right to revolution. And then the Country Party reinforcing that. Well, in 1770 in Boston, something occurred that came to be known as the Boston Massacre. Oh, I think this is Patrick Henry's rendering of it. There was sort of a mob scene in the center of town in Boston. And a number of British soldiers were there, just in case something happened. Like the mob tried to burn down the house of a customs official or something. Well, there are arguments about exactly what happened, but the colonists were yelling insults at the British soldiers and throwing snowballs. And one version of the story is that a soldier slips and his gun discharges, and then everybody thinks, who fired? Who fired? Soldiers fire, 5 colonists die. Yes. Well, now this is interesting. Those soldiers, they're put on trial. Of course, this is news all through the colonies, and people are furious. But the trial, they have to, the rule of law says that these soldiers have to have a defense. Do you know who defended the soldiers at trial? None, huh? Yes. Oh, I'm so proud that you knew. None other than John Adams, one of the revolutionists. And he does that because he wants to demonstrate to the British and to everyone else that whatever you say, colonists follow the rule of law and order. Now, one last thing, and then I'm done. If we step way, way, way far back, it is possible to see the colonists concerned about the intent of the British as a little paranoid. The British did not intend to enslave them, surely. But they did believe that their rights as Englishmen were being trampled. And that is why, in 1774, Thomas Jefferson could make a statement like this. And this represents the emerging revolutionary consensus. He said, a single act of tyranny might be dismissed as an accident, but a series of oppressions, and he's talking about Sugar Act, Stamp Act, Declaratory Act, Townshend Acts, Intolerable Acts, so on. But a series of oppressions begun at a distinguished time in history, 1763 victory, and pursued unalterably through every change of ministers. This too plainly proves a deliberate and systematical plan of reducing